At noon, bells still ring because one summer day in 1456, a fortress on the Danube refused to die, and the most feared army on earth ran from a crowd carrying farm tools. 3 years earlier, the world had watched Constantinople fall, and it felt like a door had been kicked off its hinges. The city that had survived for 1,000 years collapsed in weeks under Ottoman cannon fire, and the young Sultan Mehmed II stepped out of the smoke with a new reputation and an even bigger hunger. He was only in his early 20s, but had already proven something that terrified every kingdom in Europe. The old defenses were no longer safe. Thick stone walls, proud towers, iron gates. None of it mattered if you had enough gunpowder, enough artillery, and enough men who would keep coming no matter how many died. After Constantinople, Mehmed didn't see borders the way other rulers did. He saw a map of doors to be forced open, one after the other, and the next door was Belgrade. Belgrade wasn't just another city. It sat where the Danube meets the Sava, a strategic knot of water and land routes, a fortress that controlled movement into the Hungarian plains and deeper into Central Europe. If it fell, the path into the heart of the continent became simpler, faster, and psychologically devastating, because one more impossible fortress would have proven useless against Ottoman siege power. This is why Belgrade became a line in the ground. This is why both sides understood that what happened here would echo far beyond its walls. And this is where two very different men, ended up standing between Mehmed and the road ahead. The first was John Hunyadi, a veteran commander who had spent years fighting Ottoman forces on the frontier, a practical soldier who understood how the enemy moved, how they supplied themselves, how they attacked, and how they broke defenders not only with steel, but with fear. He wasn't a legend because he was dramatic. He was a legend because he survived and won in a kind of war that chewed up most commanders and spat out bones. By 1456, Hunyadi was worn down, sick, and carrying the weight of a kingdom that couldn't always agree on anything. Yet when crisis came, he was still the one man everyone looked to, because he knew what was coming and he knew how to meet it. The second man was John Capistrano, a Franciscan preacher in the 70s whose power wasn't in armor or tactics, but in words. He could walk into a town, speak for an hour, and lead with men following him who had never held a sword in battle. When Capistrano preached crusade, people came out of fields and workshops. Students left their studies, villagers appeared with whatever they could carry. Axes, clubs, hunting bows, spears that were really sharpened poles, and yes, tools meant for farms, not war. Hunyadi wanted disciplined soldiers who would hold a line. Capistrano brought a wave of ordinary people and called an army. Their methods clashed, their temperaments clashed, and they didn't need to like each other for fate to lock them into the same desperate defense, because Mehmed was already marching. The Ottoman host that approached Belgrade was built for siege warfare, experienced infantry including elite janissaries, supporting forces, engineers, laborers, and a serious artillery train. Numbers vary across sources, but the scale was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of men against a fortress whose defenders could not match that manpower. And it wasn't only the army. Mehmed's plan relied on control of the Danube, because an army that large is a hungry machine, and hunger destroys sieges faster than swords do. Ottoman ships and river craft aimed to secure the waterway and starve Belgrade into surrender, cutting off reinforcements and supplies, so that even the bravest offenders would eventually collapse. Inside Belgrade, people understood what Ottoman artillery could do because they had heard the stories from 1453. They knew about walls turning to rubble, about breaches widening day by day, about the slow, mechanical pressure of siege that didn't care how courageous you felt. Belgrade fortifications were strong for their era, but gunpowder was changing the meaning of strong. The city had an upper fortress and a lower town, and the lower sections were more exposed to bombardment. If the lower town fell, defenders could retreat toward the upper fortifications, but each retreat would shrink their space, increase panic, and make the final breach more likely. Still, defenders prepared the only way humans can prepare for something they know they may not survive. They repaired walls, deepened ditches, moved supplies, positioned what artillery they had, and tried to convince themselves that courage could compensate for mathematics. Then early July arrived, Ottoman forces settled into siege positions, and the cannons began to speak. The bombardment was not one dramatic moment. It was repetition, pressure, fatigue, and fear. Stone shot slammed into walls. Towers cracked, dust clouds rose, and every hit carried a message. We could do this all day, and we have more powder than you have sleep. Day after day, Belgrade's outer defenses took damage. Defenders worked like ants inside a burning house, hauling stone to plug breaches, dragging timber into place, moving earth, pulling wounded away, trying to keep the structure of the defense intact while the physical structure of the walls broke apart. MEM's engineers focus fire to create multiple weak points. Because a single breach can be defended, multiple breaches force defenders to split, to guess wrong, to run, to panic. And panic, once it starts, is more destructive than cannonballs. MEM watched with the confidence of man who had already ended an empire. He had time. He had numbers. He had artillery. He had a reputation that did have to work for him. But Hunyadi did not look only at walls. He looked at the siege as a system, and he saw what systems always depend on. Supply. An army of that size needed constant movement of food, powder, tools, and replacement materials. If you could disrupt that flow, especially on a river, then even the most powerful siege could begin to choke. This is where Hunyadi made a decision that sounded like madness to anyone who only counted ships. Around mid-July, he assembled a small flotilla, whatever could be gathered, riverboats, converted craft, anything that could carry men and fire, and prepared to strike the Ottoman river blockade. It wasn't a clean naval battle between equal fleets. It was a desperate attempt to turn the river into a weapon. The idea was simple and terrifying. Hit fast, create chaos, burn vessels, break the blockade long enough to get reinforcements and supplies into Belgrade. On July 14th, the attack came. Flames and smoke turned the Danube into confusion. In tight river space, superior numbers have become a trap. Because ships collide, formations break, and one burning vessel can drift into others, spreading fire where discipline can't stop it. Men fell into the water weighed down by armor and equipment. Currents and panic did the rest. The point wasn't to outfight the Ottoman fleet ship for ship. The point was to force a disruption so violent that control of the river became impossible in the moment that mattered. And it worked. The blockade cracked, and relief reached Belgrade. Reinforcements, supplies, and fresh defenders poured in, enough to extend the fortress's life when it was beginning to feel like the walls were being slowly erased. MEM's siege plan took a hit, not because his army suddenly became weak, but because time became less certain. A siege is patience backed by logistics. Damage the logistics, and patience turns into pressure. In response, the Ottomans intensified the bombardment and prepared for the decisive assault. By July 21st, the lower town was badly damaged, and both sides understood the next phase would be close combat, the kind of fighting where bodies fill breaches and streets become traps. As darkness approached, Ottoman forces moved to exploit the exhaustion inside the fortress, aiming to strike when visibility was poor and coordination harder. Night attacks can feel like the world itself is collapsing. You can't see the full threat. You hear it, you sense it, and suddenly the breach is alive with shadows. But Hunyadi had fought frontier wars long enough to expect it. Defenders prepared traps and positioned themselves to turn rubble slopes into killing zones. When Ottoman troops surged forward, they met not only resistance but a landscape that had been shaped to punish them. Stones rolling, fires igniting, missiles striking into packed groups where movement was restricted. Still, the Ottomans kept coming. Discipline, numbers, and relentless assault pushed the defenders back, and parts of the lower town began to fall. For the defenders, this is a moment that breaks most sieges. When the enemy is inside, when the street fighting begins, when you realize that even if you kill men by the hundreds, more will climb over the bodies. Hunyadi watched the lower town being swallowed, and made a decision that looks unthinkable until you understand what he was trying to deny. He ordered fires set in key areas of the lower town. He was willing to burn his own city because the alternative was worse. Letting the Ottomans use those streets as stable ground, as space to reorganize, reinforce, and push upward. Fire changes everything. It blocks routes. It fills lungs with smoke. It turns organized movement into stumbling. It forces attackers into narrow passages where defenders can concentrate force. It also destroys the very prize the attacker expects to use, turning victory into a trap made of heat and panic. That night, the lower town became a furnace, and Ottoman troops who had fought to enter found themselves fighting the city itself. Flames at their sides, smoke above them, defenders striking from angles they could barely see. By dawn on July 22nd, both sides were exhausted. The lower town was scarred and burning, and men prepared to finish the job with renewed pressure. He had the manpower to keep attacking. He believed the defenders had reached their limit, and in a normal siege, he would have been right. But Belgrade was no longer normal. The fight had turned into a contest of morale, timing, and chaos, and those are the kind of battles where one unexpected moment can flip the entire field. The morning brought fresh Ottoman assaults and renewed intensity near the breaches, and defenders used every advantage they had left: elevated positions, concentrated fire, and a desperate knowledge of their own terrain. Hunyadi had saved some of his limited artillery and decisive resources for moments when Ottoman forces became exposed and committed. Even small defensive guns can be devastating if used at the right second against crowded targets. Mem pressed harder, and accounts describe him bringing his presence closer to the fight, because leaders do that when they believe the final push is at hand. The pressure on the defenders became unbearable. It felt like the fortress was bending. It felt like the last line was about to snap. And then the moment arrived that should have turned into disaster. Capistrano's Crusader followers, the irregular crowd of peasants, townsmen, and volunteers, had not been expected to execute disciplined battlefield maneuvers. Many were meant to remain behind defensive positions. But in the heat of the crisis, groups surged forward beyond orders, spilling into the fight in chaotic waves. From a strict military perspective, this was a nightmare. Untrained people charging professional troops can be butchered quickly, and their panic can infect everyone around them. Hunyadi reportedly reacted with alarm because he understood that disorder can destroy a defense. But then something else happened, something that doesn't appear on a map or in a weapons list. The Ottoman line hesitated, not because farm tools are superior to swords, but because unpredictability disrupts pattern. Professional soldiers trained to read formation, signals, and structure movement. A chaotic mass does not move like a professional unit. It surges, it stops, it screams, it pushes, it collapses, it rises again. It creates uncertainty about what is happening and where the real threat is. It breaks rhythm. And rhythm, especially in assault warfare, is everything. Capistrano, old and relentless, moved with the crowd, holding a cross and shouting encouragement, turning fear into forward motion. His followers pressed into Ottoman positions with raw momentum, and even when they died, more pushed behind them. It was brutal, chaotic, and shockingly effective at one specific job: buy a moment of confusion. Hunyadi recognized that moment and made the decision that saved Belgrade. He didn't waste time trying to restore perfect discipline. He exploited the chaos. He ordered a coordinated counterattack to support the surge, sending experienced fighters to strike where the Ottoman line was disturbed. Suddenly, the irregular wave was not alone. It became the front edge of a wider push. From the Ottoman perspective, the battlefield stopped behaving correctly. Instead of a fortress that was shrinking inward, the defense began to surge outward. Instead of defenders collapsing into the upper town, attackers began to feel pressure toward their own lines. And this is where siege warfare becomes psychologically fragile. Attackers assume the city is the trapped animal. When the trapped animal lunges, it can startle even a superior force, especially if the attacker's forward units are crowded, tired, and operating in smoke and confusion. The counterattack reached into Ottoman forward positions and, in the chaos, threatened crucial assets: supplies, siege equipment, and artillery areas. Capturing or disabling enemy guns is not only a tactical success, it is a mental, a blow to confidence. Artillery represented Ottoman modern power and the promise of inevitable victory. When parts of that system became vulnerable, the idea of inevitability cracked. Now add the most dangerous ingredient on any battlefield: rumor. During the fighting, Mem was wounded. Sources differ on exact detail, but the important truth is that word spread that the Sultan had been hit. In an army where the Sultan's presence symbolized control and destiny, that kind of news can detonate morale. On a battlefield, truth travels slowly. Fear travels fast. The Sultan is down. The Sultan is dead. The camp is lost. Even if officers try to correct it, panic has already begun its work. Once panic starts, Numbers stop helping. Roads clog. Units collide. Orders are ignored. A controlled withdrawal becomes a stampede. Men run not because they lack courage, but because they believe the structure holding them together has collapsed, and no one wants to be the last man left standing when everyone else is fleeing. The Ottoman forces began to fall back from the immediate pressure points. Then the fall back turned uneven. Then it turned into a wider retreat. And once retreat becomes mass movement, the battlefield becomes lethal in a different way. Men trample each other. Choke points become death traps, and the very routes that brought the army forward, river crossings, narrow paths, crowded camps, become places where thousands can die without ever meeting an enemy blade. The defenders, fueled by survival instinct and the sudden realization that the impossible might be happening, pushed harder. The Ottoman camp, so confident, so prepared, so full of supplies and siege materials, became a place of abandonment. Soldiers dropped equipment to move faster. Units that had been feared across regions dissolved into frantic movement. By the afternoon of July 22nd, the siege had collapsed. Belgrade still stood, not untouched, burned, broken, and soaked in blood, but unbroken in the one way that mattered. The Ottomans had not taken it. The aftershock ran across Europe because everyone understood the stakes. Belgrade had been viewed as the gate, and the gate had held. News reached the papal court, and Pope Calixtus III, who had urged prayers for Belgrade during the siege, ordered bells to ring at midday, a practice that in many places continued as a remembrance and thanksgiving. It became one of those traditions that outlast the people who started it, where later generations hear a sound and don't realize the story trapped inside it. But victory didn't end the suffering. A siege leaves bodies, wounds, smoke damage, contaminated water, and exhausted people packed into ruined spaces. Disease followed, as it often did in medieval warfare, and the aftermath killed men who had survived the assault. John Hunyadi, the commander whose decisions had shaped the defense, died weeks later, his health finally collapsing under the combined weight of war and sickness. John Capistrano also died not long afterward, the old preacher's body giving out after the strain of the campaign. They did not live long enough to enjoy the legend they created. What they left behind was time. Time for Central Europe to breathe. Time for defenses to adjust. Time for political leaders to argue and reorganize. Time that would not have existed if Belgrade had fallen in 1456. Mem, too, did not stop being powerful because of this defeat. The Ottoman Empire remained formidable, and Mem would still campaign elsewhere. But the aura of inevitability took a blow. Belgrade demonstrated that artillery superiority did not guarantee success if supply lines were disrupted, if defenders used the rain intelligently, if morale held, and if the attacker's plan met unexpected chaos at the worst possible moment. It also demonstrated something uncomfortable for neat military theory. Sometimes discipline is not enough when the battlefield becomes psychologically unstable. A professional army depends on cohesion and confidence. Break those, and even elite troops can unravel. Belgrade was not a fairy tale where farmers magically outfight trained soldiers. It was a real, violent intersection of strategy and desperation. Hunyadi's river strike showed how logistics can decide a siege. The burning of the lower town showed how denying space can neutralize an attacker's strengths. The sudden Crusader surge, disordered, emotional, and risky, created confusion at exactly the moment the Ottomans needed clarity. Hunyadi's choice to support that surge rather than fight, it turned chaos into opportunity. And the spread of fear through rumor did what no sword could do as quickly. It collapsed the belief that the siege was unstoppable. That is why historians still talk about Belgrade. Not because it was clean or simple, but because it was a case study in how wars can pivot on human factors as much as on numbers and technology. If Belgrade had fallen, the path north and west would have been easier, and the political landscape of the region could have shifted dramatically. But it did not fall. It survived because two very different leaders, one a hardened commander, one a religious preacher, each contributed what the other lacked: planning and inspiration, structure and spirit. And it survived because ordinary people, however untrained, sometimes refuse to behave the way an empire expects them to behave. They don't retreat when they should. They don't break when the math says they must. They do something irrational, something dangerous, something that looks like madness from a distance. Then history, for a moment, bends around it. So the next time you hear bells at noon, remember that somewhere behind that sound is a summer battlefield on the Danube, a burning lower town, a battered fortress wall, and a day when the conqueror Constantinople came to Europe's gate and had to turn back